Welcome back to another revision video with Miss Sweet. Today we are exploring the poem Remains in greater detail. A helpful tip to remember when analyzing: most of these poets within the Power and Conflict anthology want to be deep and meaningful, and generally throw religious, political, or historical Easter eggs into their work. These are great pieces to pick apart and analyze, and will definitely receive the highest marks if justified correctly. Grab something to drink and your notes, and let's get started. In 2019, Armitage became the Poet Laureate. His poetry focuses on relatable situations, using accessible language, combined with complex structure to explore themes. Remains is one of the standout pieces in Simon Armitage's compelling collection, The Not Dead. This anthology of war poems delves deep into the harrowing experiences of ex-soldiers, drawing on their testimonies to explore the lingering shadows of conflict. Armitage doesn't shy away from the raw aftermath of war, portraying the intense struggle with traumatic memories that many veterans face. In Remains, Armitage hones in on a particularly poignant story. The poem tells of a soldier haunted by the memory of killing a man caught looting a bank during a conflict, implicitly set in the Middle East. What makes this piece striking is Armitage's masterful use of conversational language. His inclusion of colloquialisms and everyday speech, combined with stark, vivid imagery, paints a gripping and authentic picture of a person tormented by grief, guilt, and trauma. The soldier's narrative unfolds with a brutal honesty, offering readers a visceral glimpse into the emotional scars left by war. In 1998, Iraq suspended cooperation with UN weapons inspectors, external, and the US and UK responded with airstrikes. After Al-Qaeda's September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, President George W. Bush's administration started making plans to invade Iraq. President Bush claimed Saddam was continuing to stockpile and manufacture WMDs, and that Iraq was part of an international axis of evil, external, along with Iran and North Korea. In October 2002, the U.S. Congress authorized the use of military force against Iraq. Many people in Washington believed that there was significant evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and that it posed a genuine threat. The U.S. said it would not wait for the inspectors to report, and assembled a coalition of the willing, external against Iraq. At dawn on March 20, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom began with 295,000 U.S. and allied troops invading Iraq across its border with Kuwait. By May, Iraq's army had been defeated and its regime overthrown. Saddam Hussein was later captured, tried, and executed. However, no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. It is estimated that 461,000 people died in Iraq from war-related causes between 2003 and 2011, and that the war cost the U.S. $3 trillion. External Remains is made up of 7 unrhymed quatrains, 4-line stanzas, and one final, unrhymed couplet, a 2-line stanza. At first glance, the poem seems relatively organized. The stanzas are, for the most part, regular. But when actually reading through the poem, it becomes clear that there's chaos under the surface. Though the first 7 stanzas all have 4 lines, the speaker's phrases themselves often don't line up with the form at hand. That is, the speaker frequently enjambs lines or inserts jerky pauses in the middle of lines. The speaker even uses enjambment across stanza breaks, suggesting that the form here isn't actually as steady as it looks. The speaker is trying to keep things orderly, to tell this story in a logical way, but ultimately fails to do so. The final 2 lines, then, feel almost anticlimactic. The poem ends abruptly, sooner than the reader has come to expect. It feels as if the speaker suddenly has nothing left to say, or, perhaps, the speaker is so overwhelmed by guilt and trauma that continuing is impossible. The poem has no regular meter, and is written in free verse. This makes sense, given that it's meant to feel very casual and conversational, the speaker seems to be telling this tale off the cuff, and hasn't rehearsed any of these lines beforehand. As such, the poem is made up of lines that vary greatly in length and rhythm. One line does stand out from the rest, however, line 27, the longest line of the poem, which has 14 syllables. Not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land. By this point in the poem, the speaker has transitioned from telling this story in a detached manner to seeming entirely consumed and overwhelmed by trauma and guilt. This run-on line might suggest the way that speaker's thoughts are running out of control. The sheer length of this line suggests that the speaker is becoming increasingly frantic and distraught. The poem doesn't feel overly literary or poetic, but rather like an ordinary person telling a story. This is deliberate on the part of the poet. This is a poem about the horrific, everyday realities of war, and the language takes care not to glorify what's happening. That said, rhyme does appear occasionally throughout the poem. The clearest example comes in the 7th stanza, where land in line 27 rhymes fully with sand in line 28. The final line of the poem, hands, rhymes as well. There's also a great deal of consonance in this stanza, as well as assonance of the long I sound that feels a bit like rhyme in lines 25 and 26. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines. Altogether, this creates a heightening of the poem's language that appropriately appears at a moment of heightened emotion. The title is a pun that plays on the idea of both human remains, referencing the body of the dead man, and the horrific memories that remain with the speaker after the fact. The poem examines the effects of guilt and trauma, both during and after active duty, and suggests that the effects of wartime violence linger long after soldiers leave the battlefield. The poem demonstrates the struggle of soldiers suffering with PTSD from serving in the military. The first 2 stanzas also contain very matter-of-fact statements, presenting the soldier's task as almost boring. Their violent reaction to the fleeing looter seems nearly automatic. This is simply what they've been trained to do. Yet the speaker repeatedly says that the looter was probably armed, possibly not, suggesting an internal conflict over whether this was justified self-defense in a war zone or the murder of an unarmed man. The deceased man is also only ever characterized as a looter. To be a looter, rather than simply a man or even a guy, removes an element of his humanity, which may be another attempt to diminish the guilt the speaker feels over his death. On a similar note, when discussing the actual act of killing, the speaker uses the first-person plural, we. This shares the blame among all 3 soldiers who opened fire, again suggesting the speaker's need to feel distanced from what happened. Of course, the traumatic memories described belong only to the speaker. And it quickly becomes apparent that the speaker can't stop vividly replaying the man's death. For example, when talking about the gunfire, the speaker says, "I see every round as it rips through his life," suggesting a horrifying dragging out of this violent act. This disturbing imagery, especially coming on the tail of such nonchalance, suggests that even as war normalizes or numbs people to extreme violence, life will never be the same for the speaker, or, of course, for the dead man. The speaker's earlier use of everyday language, in turn, comes to highlight that this is an ordinary person who has carried out an extreme act of violence and is having difficulty processing it. Later, the repetition of week after week, referring to the speaker out on patrol, comes to foreshadow the endless cycle of traumatic memories that will characterize the speaker's life on leave. The blood shadow in this stanza also carries a ghostly connotation, suggesting the speaker is haunted by the grisly way the looter died. Finally, the speaker states that the man is here in my head when I close my eyes, and that the speaker carries his bloody life in my bloody hands, suggesting an unshakable sense of guilt about the man's death. In war Photographer, the protagonist appears to have become desensitized to the horrors of war. For instance, the alliteration/sibilance "spools of suffering" is rhythmically read aloud with ease and almost rolls off the tongue, implying that, perhaps due to experience, this process has become instinctive. Alternatively, he is no longer affected by it, despite there being large quantities, spools, of presumably quite lurid, suffering, imagery before him. This sense is compounded by the simile as though he a priest preparing to intone a mass. This simile signifies that he is acting out of a solemn duty, as a priest would, performing a ritual that may not be pleasant, but must be done regardless. Such a sacrifice would be salient to the reader and elicit much gratitude and sympathy, which could have been the objective of Duffy, who is friends with people, McCullen and Griffiths, who specialize in war photography and have struggled with what they have witnessed. War Photographer, by Carroll and Duffy, and Remains, by Simon Armitage both delve into the psychological effects of war, though they approach this theme through different lenses and techniques. Duffy's poem uses the third-person perspective to portray the emotional turmoil of a war photographer who grapples with the dichotomy between his ordered darkroom and the chaotic war zones he captures on film. The structured form and regular rhyme scheme mirror the photographer's attempt to impose order on the horrors he witnesses. In contrast, Armitage's Remains is a first-person narrative that offers a raw, intimate portrayal of a soldier's lingering trauma and guilt. The conversational tone and irregular structure reflect the fragmented nature of the speaker's memories and his struggle to come to terms with his actions. Both poems use vivid imagery and repetition to convey the haunting memories of war, yet, while War Photographer maintains a reflective and somber tone, Remains is confessional and immediate, drawing the reader directly into the soldier's personal experience. Remains is challenging to analyze, because it stands out in its raw depiction of a soldier's personal feelings and direct experiences. Its focus on the psychological impact of war delivers a strong, unfiltered message about its horrors. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you found this helpful.